Hello and welcome to Cheating Message. Subscribe to the channel by clicking on the bell to not miss new videos. And don't forget to like us because it's the best support for us. Helen's journey began with a dream. A dream born in the small village where she had spent her childhood. Life had always been a challenge for her family, but they faced every hardship together with love and determination. Her parents, humble farmers, worked tirelessly to provide for their daughter, instilling in her the values of hard work, kindness, and resilience. Helen grew up knowing that education was her path to a better future, and when she received a scholarship to attend a prestigious university in the capital, it felt like the culmination of everything her family had ever worked for. Her parents had hugged her tightly the morning she left, their eyes shining with pride and unspoken fears. "Remember, Helen," her father had said as he helped load her small suitcase into the bus. "You may be going to a place full of wealth and big dreams, but what matters most is staying true to who you are." As the bus pulled away from the dusty roads of her village, Helen stared out the window, her heart a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. The capital was vast, bustling with life and energy, a place she had only seen in books or heard about from the rare visitors who had passed through their town. She imagined it would be a place where intellect and hard work were rewarded, where people would see beyond her humble beginnings and recognize the determination burning inside her. But when she arrived at the university, the reality was harsher than her hopeful visions. From the moment she stepped on a campus, she felt the weight of her difference. Her clothes, simple and practical, stood out among the designer outfits worn by her classmates. She overheard whispers as she walked past groups of students, those from wealthy families who wore their privilege like a second skin. Helen quickly realized that here, status was an invisible barrier, and her lack of it marked her as an outsider. It wasn't long before she felt the sting of being underestimated. In her first week, during an introductory seminar, a professor asked the students to share their backgrounds. As one after another spoke of their family legacies, business tycoons, politicians, and celebrities, Helen felt herself shrink into her seat. When it was her turn, she spoke with quiet pride about her village, her parents' struggles, and the scholarship that had brought her to this room. The silence that followed was deafening. A few students exchanged glances, eyebrows raised in thinly veiled disbelief. One girl, sitting near the front, turned and whispered to her friend, loud enough for Helen to hear, "How did someone like her even get in?" That night, alone in her small dorm room, Helen fought back tears. She had expected the university to be challenging, but she hadn't anticipated feeling so small, so invisible. For the first time in her life, she questioned whether she belonged here at all. But Helen was not one to give up easily. Despite the coldness of her peers, she threw herself into her studies, determined to prove that she was more than her background. She spent long hours in the library, poring over textbooks and research papers, finding solace in the quiet corners where no one could judge her. Yet, the isolation weighed on her. As much as she excelled academically, the loneliness gnawed at her heart. It was during one of these long nights in the library that Helen met Simon. He was sitting at a nearby table, a stack of philosophy books in front of him, scribbling furiously in a notebook. Something about the intensity of his focus caught her attention. They had passed each other in the halls before, but she had never spoken to him. He seemed different from the others, quieter, more thoughtful. "Long night?" he asked, noticing her glance over. She nodded, managing a small smile. "Feels like every night is long lately." Simon chuckled, closing his book. "Tell me about it. It feels like no matter how much I read, there's always more to understand." Over time, they began to sit together more often. Simon wasn't like the others. He didn't care about money or status. He, too, was searching for something deeper, something real in a world that seemed obsessed with appearances. They talked for hours about life, about the pressure to fit into molds that weren't meant for them, and about how exhausting it was to constantly prove themselves. "You know," Simon said one evening as they walked through the campus gardens, "people like us, we're stronger than we think. We don't have the luxury of hiding behind our family's wealth. Everything we do is ours, earned through hard work. That's what matters." His words stayed with her. Slowly, Helen began to find her footing again. She stopped caring about what her classmates thought of her, focusing instead on what she could control: her studies, her friendships, her values. And as she grew more comfortable in her own skin, something remarkable happened. People began to notice her for the right reasons. A professor who had once dismissed her as another quiet student from nowhere began to recognize her sharp intellect. Classmates who had once whispered behind her back started to come to her for help with their work. And Simon became her closest friend, and perhaps something more. But as Helen started to carve out her place in this world, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real challenges were still ahead. She was beginning to see that true success wasn't measured by grades or accolades, but by staying true to the person she had always been, no matter how much the world around her tried to change her. And this was only the beginning of her story. Helen's life at the university began to settle into a rhythm, though it was far from easy. The invisible barriers of wealth and privilege that separated her from most of her classmates were still present, but Helen no longer let them define her. Instead, she focused on the one thing she could control: her studies. Long hours in the library became her refuge, and her dedication began to pay off. Professors took notice of her insightful questions. Her essays stood out for their depth, and though she kept to herself, Helen's name started to be whispered for different reasons. Yet, her success only made her more of an enigma to her classmates. In seminar discussions, some students still looked at her as if she didn't belong, their eyes questioning how someone from her background could excel in such a prestigious environment. One afternoon, while waiting outside a lecture hall, Helen overheard a group of girls gossiping behind her. "Have you noticed how she's always top of the class?" one of them said. "It's like she has something to prove." "She's probably here on some charity scholarship," another replied. "Makes sense, right? People like her don't get in unless someone pities them." The words stung, but Helen forced herself to walk past them, her chin held high. She refused to let them see how their comments affected her. But the loneliness of it all weighed heavily. No matter how well she performed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she would never truly fit in. Even among the few students who were kind to her, she felt out of place, an outsider in a world that wasn't hers. Simon remained her one constant. As the weeks turned into months, their friendship deepened. They spent countless evenings walking the quiet paths around campus or studying together in the library until the early hours of the morning. Simon was different. He didn't care about appearances or where people came from. He was searching for something meaningful, just like she was. One evening, as they sat on a bench overlooking the city lights from the university hill, Simon turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever feel like we're chasing the wrong things here?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Like everyone's so focused on grades, careers, money. But does any of it really matter?" Helen smiled, a little surprised. "I think about that all the time. Back home, success meant something different. It wasn't about wealth or titles. It was about being good to others, working hard, staying honest. Here, it feels like everything is measured by what you have." Simon nodded, staring out at the distant city lights. "Exactly. I came here thinking I'd find answers, but now I'm not so sure. I see people so wrapped up in themselves, so determined to prove they're better than everyone else. It's exhausting. Sometimes I think the only thing that matters is the connections we make, the people we care about." Helen turned to look at him, her heart stirring with something she couldn't quite name. In Simon's words, she heard echoes of her parents' teachings, lessons about the true meaning of success, about love and kindness being more important than anything material. She realized then that Simon wasn't just a friend. He was someone who saw the world the way she did, someone who believed in the things that mattered most. As the weeks passed, their bond grew stronger. They shared more than just academic struggles. They confided in each other their hopes, fears, and dreams. Helen found herself looking forward to their time together, feeling a sense of ease and comfort she hadn't known since she left her village. There was an unspoken understanding between them, something that didn't need to be explained or justified. But the closer they grew, the more complicated things became. One day, Helen received a letter from her parents. It was filled with their usual warmth and encouragement, but there was a subtle undercurrent of worry. The crops hadn't been good that year, and her father's health had been fragile. Her mother's words were gentle, not wanting to burden Helen, but Helen could read between the lines. Life back home was becoming harder, and her family needed her. For days, she wrestled with guilt. Here she was, surrounded by the opportunities her parents had worked so hard to give her, yet they were struggling just to make ends meet. She thought of the money she had to spend on books, the expensive fees that the scholarship didn't cover, and the reality of how little she could send back home. The weight of it pressed down on her, a constant reminder of the sacrifices her family had made for her to be here. Helen confided in Simon one evening after their usual study session. "I feel so guilty," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "My family is struggling, and I'm here, living in a world they can't even imagine. They've given up so much for me, and I don't know if I can ever repay them." Simon looked at her with compassion. "Helen, you're doing exactly what they wanted for you. They believed in your dreams, in your ability to create a better life. You're here because they wanted you to have something more. You can't carry the weight of their sacrifices on your shoulders alone." "I know," she said softly, "but it's hard. Every time I feel like I'm making progress, I remember that they're still back there, working day and night just to get by." Simon was quiet for a moment, then reached out, placing his hand gently on hers. "You're doing more than you realize, Helen. Your success is their success. They're proud of you. I'm proud of you." His words brought a warmth to her heart that she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in weeks, the guilt seemed to loosen its grip, if only a little. But as she looked into Simon's eyes, she realized that her feelings for him were changing. What had started as friendship had quietly deepened into something more, something neither of them had acknowledged, but both had felt. Helen didn't know what to do with these feelings. She wasn't ready for them, not when her life was already so complicated. But there they were, undeniable and real. And she knew, sooner or later, they would have to face them. Yet, amid her growing emotions, something unexpected was brewing. A twist that would change everything Helen thought she knew about her place in this world. As Helen's second year at university began, she found herself caught between the rising demands of her studies, the pressure of her family's struggles, and her growing connection with Simon. Their friendship had blossomed into something deeper, though neither of them had spoken about it openly. It was as if the words hovered between them, too fragile to be uttered, but too powerful to ignore. Helen had always been focused on her goals, determined to rise above her circumstances through hard work. But now, as she navigated her academic challenges, something else was stirring inside her, something that made her question what truly mattered in her life. One evening, as Helen was reviewing notes in her room, a knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Simon, his expression unusually serious. "Can we talk?" he asked. Helen nodded, gesturing for him to come in. He sat down on the edge of her bed, running a hand through his hair before looking up at her. "I've been thinking a lot lately about us," he began. Her heart skipped a beat, but she stayed silent, letting him continue. "I didn't plan for this to happen," Simon admitted, his voice soft. "But I can't pretend I don't have feelings for you anymore, Helen. I've tried to bury them, to just focus on being your friend. But it's not enough. I care about you more than I thought I ever could." Helen's chest tightened, the emotion she had been keeping at bay suddenly rushing to the surface. She had been afraid of this conversation, afraid that once it was spoken aloud, everything would change. "I care about you too, Simon," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. "But my life is complicated right now. There's so much going on with my family, my studies. I don't know if I can handle something more." Simon nodded, understanding etched on his face. "I know, and I don't want to add pressure to your life. But I had to be honest with you. I had to tell you how I feel, because pretending everything's the same isn't working anymore." Helen felt torn. On one hand, Simon was the one person in the city who made her feel understood and seen for who she truly was, not where she came from. But on the other hand, she feared that stepping into a relationship would complicate things further. Her family needed her focus, her studies were demanding, and she wasn't sure she could give Simon the attention he deserved. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken possibilities hanging between them. "I don't want to lose our friendship," Helen said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'm scared, Simon. Scared of what this means, and scared of what I might lose if it goes wrong." Simon reached for her hand, holding it gently. "You won't lose me, Helen. No matter what happens, I'll be here. But I had to let you know the truth. The rest is up to you." Helen squeezed his hand, feeling the warmth of his touch. "I need time," she said quietly. Simon nodded, standing up slowly. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." After he left, Helen lay back on her bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. She had never imagined love would enter her life while she was still fighting for her future, but here it was, complicating everything. Days passed, and Helen buried herself in her studies, trying to find some clarity. She spent hours in the library, poring over books and research, hoping the academic world would distract her from her tangled emotions. But Simon's words lingered in her mind, refusing to fade. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting lecture, Helen decided to take a walk to clear her head. She wandered through the campus, lost in thought, until she found herself in the quiet gardens at the edge of the university. The gardens had always been her refuge, a place to think without distractions. As she sat on a bench, watching the autumn leaves flutter to the ground, she realized that avoiding her feelings wouldn't make them go away. She thought about her parents, about how they had always encouraged her to be strong, but had also shown her that love mattered just as much as hard work. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Love isn't a distraction, Helen. It's what gives us the strength to keep going." At that moment, Helen knew what she had to do. She couldn't keep pushing Simon away out of fear. Life was already full of uncertainties, and love, if anything, was something worth embracing, not avoiding. That evening, Helen found Simon in their usual study spot at the library. He looked up as she approached, his expression guarded but hopeful. "Can we talk?" she asked, echoing the words he had used before. Simon nodded, closing his book and giving her his full attention. Helen sat down, her heart pounding. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began. "About us, about everything. And I realized that I don't want to run away from this." Simon's eyes softened, but he didn't interrupt. "I'm scared," Helen admitted, "but I don't want to be. I care about you too much to let fear stop me from seeing where this could go." Simon's expression broke into a smile, one of pure relief and joy. "You have no idea how long I've wanted to hear that." Helen smiled back, feeling the weight lift from her chest. "I'm not promising I have everything figured out," she continued, "but I don't want to lose what we have. I want to try." Simon reached for her hand again, just like he had before, but this time there was no hesitation. "That's all I could ever ask for, Helen." For the first time in months, Helen felt a sense of peace. It wasn't that all her problems had disappeared. They were still very real. Her family struggles, her academic challenges, and the weight of her future still loomed large. But now, she didn't feel so alone. Simon was with her, and together they could face whatever came next. But life, as Helen would soon learn, had its own plans. Just when things seemed to be falling into place, an unexpected letter arrived from home, carrying news that would shake her world and threaten everything she had worked so hard to build. The letter arrived on a crisp November morning, sealed with her mother's familiar handwriting. Helen hadn't expected it, not so soon after their last exchange, and when she saw it lying on her desk, a chill ran through her. She picked it up carefully, sensing that whatever news it held, it would change things. She closed the door to her dorm room before sitting on her bed and opening the envelope. Her mother's words were full of love, but also a quiet urgency that made Helen's heart sink with every line. Dear Helen, I've tried not to worry you these past months, but things have gotten more difficult at home. The crops have failed again this year, and your father's health has taken a turn for the worse. He refuses to stop working, even though the doctor insists he needs rest. We've been doing our best, but the bills are piling up faster than we can manage. I didn't want to tell you, knowing how hard you're working at university, but I can't keep this from you any longer. We're going to need help, my love. Your father is too proud to ask, but I know you would want to know the truth. I don't want you to worry, but if there's any way you can come home, even for a short while, it would mean the world to us. We miss you every day, and we are so proud of everything you're doing. I know you'll make the right choice, whatever that may be. With all my love, your mother. Helen's hands trembled as she folded the letter. Her parents had always been strong, always found a way to get through even the hardest of times. But now, for the first time, they needed her. The realization weighed heavily on her chest. What was she supposed to do? Her studies had consumed her life here, and she was just starting to make progress, both academically and with Simon. But the thought of her father struggling with his health while her mother tried to manage the farm alone made her stomach churn with guilt. She sat there, the letter in her lap, feeling utterly torn between two worlds: the life she was building for herself in the city and the family that had sacrificed everything to get her here. Later that evening, she went to meet Simon. She had planned to tell him everything, but when she saw him waiting for her with his usual easy smile, her resolve crumbled. She wasn't ready to share the burden yet. She wasn't ready to face the decision she knew she had to make. So instead, she went through the motions of their evening, pretending nothing had changed. Days passed, and the weight of her secret grew heavier. She could hardly concentrate on her studies, her mind constantly drifting back to the farm and her parents. Every time she thought about the letter, a gnawing anxiety crept in, telling her that she needed to do something. But what could she do? If she left now, she might lose her place at the university, and if she stayed, her family might fall into even greater hardship. It wasn't until the weekend, when she and Simon had planned a quiet afternoon together, that everything came to a head. They were sitting on the steps of the university's library, watching students pass by, when Simon noticed her distant expression. "Helen, are you okay? You seem different lately." Helen bit her lip, staring at the ground. She knew she couldn't hide it any longer. "I got a letter from my mother," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "Things at home, they're worse than I thought. My father's sick, and they're struggling with the farm. My mother asked me to come back, even if just for a little while, but I don't know what to do." Simon's face softened with concern. "Helen, why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I didn't want to worry you," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't know how to handle it. If I leave now, I could fall behind. But if I stay, I feel like I'm abandoning them." Simon reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "You're not abandoning them, Helen. You're doing what they wanted for you, pursuing your education. But I understand how hard this must be for you." Helen shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I don't know what to do, Simon. I feel like I'm being pulled in two directions, and I can't do both. I can't be here and help them at the same time." For a long moment, Simon said nothing, letting her words sink in. Then he spoke quietly, his voice steady. "Maybe there's a way you can do both." Helen looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "Maybe you don't have to choose one over the other. You could go home, help them get through this tough time, and then come back. I know it sounds risky, but there are ways to make it work. You could talk to your professors, explain the situation. They might grant you a temporary leave. You've worked so hard, Helen, they'll understand." Helen blinked, the idea catching her by surprise. Could it really be that simple? Could she leave and come back without losing everything she had worked for? Would they really do that? She asked, her voice tinged with hope. "Of course," Simon said firmly. "They know how talented you are, how dedicated. And besides, your family needs you right now. No one could blame you for that. A small spark of relief flickered in Helen's chest, though it was still mixed with fear. But what if I fall too far behind? What if I can't catch up? Simon smiled gently. I'll be here. I'll help you with whatever you miss. You won't be alone in this. His words wrapped around her like a comforting embrace, and for the first time since she received the letter, Helen felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to choose between her family and her future. Maybe she could find a way to be there for both. The following week, Helen met with her professors. She explained the situation, her voice trembling as she spoke of her family's struggles. To her surprise, they were understanding, more so than she had imagined. They granted her a short leave of absence, assuring her that they would help her catch up when she returned. With a mixture of relief and anxiety, Helen packed her bags and prepared for the journey back to the village. As she boarded the bus that would take her home, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for Simon. His belief in her had given her the courage to make this decision, to trust that she could handle whatever came next. The familiar landscape of her village came into view, and as the bus rolled to a stop, Helen's heart ached with both joy and sadness. She hadn't been back since she left for the city, and now, the sight of the worn roads and humble houses felt both comforting and bittersweet. Her mother was waiting for her at the bus stop, her face lighting up when she saw Helen step off the bus. They embraced tightly, and for the first time in months, Helen felt truly at home. But as they walked back to the farmhouse, her mother filled her in on the harsh reality of her father's condition. The days that followed were difficult. Helen spent her mornings tending to the farm, helping her father as much as he would allow, and her afternoons sitting by his bedside, urging him to rest. The work was physically exhausting, but being there for her family gave her a new sense of purpose. She had made the right choice, even if it meant sacrificing some time at the university. But as the weeks went on, Helen began to wonder, would she ever be able to return? The more she helped, the more her family needed her, and she knew that letting go would be harder than she had imagined. As the weeks passed, Helen found herself deeply entangled in the rhythms of home. Each day was a balancing act, tending to the farm, caring for her father, and trying to maintain some semblance of her academic studies from a distance. The work was grueling, but there was also a quiet satisfaction in being there for her parents, in feeling their gratitude and love. She could see the toll her father's illness had taken on him, the weight of years of hard work bending his frame. But even in his weakened state, he would smile at her, telling her how proud he was, how much she had grown. But underneath it all, a nagging fear had begun to settle in Helen's heart. The days stretched into weeks, and she began to doubt if she could ever return to university. What had started as a temporary leave was now beginning to feel more permanent. Her father's condition was slow to improve, and her family's financial struggles showed no signs of easing. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her, and Helen started to wonder if her place was no longer in the city but here, where she was needed most. It was a cold evening in late winter when Simon's letter arrived. Helen had been sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through bills and receipts, when her mother handed her the envelope. The sight of Simon's handwriting immediately filled her with warmth, a reminder of the life she had left behind in the city, the world she was now so far from. She opened the letter slowly, her heart beating faster with every word. I hope this letter finds you well. It feels like it's been so long since we last spoke, and I've missed you more than I can say. I understand why you had to leave, and I respect your decision to be with your family. But things aren't the same here without you. The campus feels emptier, the library quieter. I still sit in our usual spot, but it's not the same without you across the table. Your professors have been asking about you, and I told them you were doing everything you could to come back. They understand, but it's clear that your presence is missed. I know this is hard, and I know you're probably feeling torn between your family and your future. But Helen, you've worked so hard to get here. Don't let go of your dreams just yet. I believe in you, and I know you can find a way back. I'm here for you, whatever you decide. But I can't help hoping that you'll come back, that we can pick up where we left off. You don't have to do this alone. With all my heart, Simon. Helen read the letter twice, her eyes lingering on Simon's words, feeling the ache of missing him. His encouragement touched something deep inside her, something she had been trying to suppress since the moment she stepped off the bus in her village. She had convinced herself that it was enough to be here, that helping her parents was the right thing to do. And it was. But Simon's words reminded her of the part of herself she had buried beneath duty and responsibility. Her dreams, her goals, the future she had envisioned. That night, as Helen lay in bed, staring up at the familiar ceiling of her childhood room, she knew she was at a crossroads. She had given everything to help her family, but the pull to return to university, to the life she had fought so hard to build, was growing stronger with every passing day. The reality of her father's illness was still there, but she realized that staying indefinitely wouldn't change the fact that her dreams were slipping away. The next morning, as she helped her father settle into his chair by the fireplace, she finally found the courage to speak the thoughts that had been swirling in her mind. "Papa," she began, her voice hesitant, "I need to talk to you about something." Her father looked up at her with kind but weary eyes, nodding for her to continue. "I've been thinking about going back to the university," Helen said softly, her heart racing as she spoke. "I came home because you needed me, and I'm glad I did. But I can't help feeling like I'm leaving something unfinished. I've worked so hard to get there, and now I'm afraid I'm letting it all slip away." Her father's face softened, and he reached out to take her hand, his grip gentle but firm. "Helen, we never wanted you to sacrifice your dreams for us. You've already done so much, more than we ever asked for. But this opportunity, your education, it's your future. It's what we've always wanted for you." Tears welled up in Helen's eyes. "But I can't just leave you and Mama when things are still hard." Her father shook his head slowly. "We'll manage. We've managed before, and we'll manage again. You need to go back, Helen. You belong there. You've made a difference here, and we love you for it. But we don't want you to stay at the cost of your own happiness." Her mother, who had been standing quietly in the doorway, stepped into the room and placed a hand on Helen's shoulder. "Your father's right," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You've always been meant for more, Helen. We've seen it in you since you were little. Go back. Finish what you started. We'll be fine." Helen's chest tightened, her emotions swirling in a mix of relief and sadness. She had been waiting for permission, though she hadn't realized it until now. Her parents, despite everything, wanted her to follow her dreams, even if it meant she couldn't be with them every day. The decision was made. With her parents' blessing and Simon's unwavering support, Helen packed her bags once again. Saying goodbye to her parents was harder than it had been the first time, but this time there was a sense of peace, a knowledge that she was doing what was right, not just for her family, but for herself. When she returned to the university, the world felt different, but in a good way. Her professors welcomed her back, and with Simon's help, she quickly caught up on the coursework she had missed. It wasn't easy, but she was more determined than ever. Helen had learned something important during her time at home: the true meaning of balance. She could love and care for her family while still pursuing her own path. She didn't have to choose one over the other. She could be both a daughter and a scholar, both a caretaker and a dreamer. And as she stood with Simon one evening, overlooking the city lights from their favorite spot, she realized that her future was wide open. Whatever came next, whether it was academic success, love, or the challenges that life would inevitably bring, she knew she had the strength to face it. Because she had learned that true success wasn't just about outward achievements. It was about staying true to herself, to the people she loved, and to the values that had guided her through the hardest of times. And with Simon by her side, she knew that whatever happened, she would never face it alone.